Well, let's begin. I want to take you on a story. I'm going to tell you a story, like I said last night, but I want to start it with a big question. And the big question I want us to explore is a why question. And I think we share this both in North America as well as in New Zealand, and maybe across the West, maybe across the globe right now. And this big why question is just why right now, maybe in the last 5-6 years, why does it feel like ministry is so hard? Why does it feel like the life of a congregation and leading a congregation is so hard? That's our big why question. Now, I hate it and find it deeply annoying when people give you a question and then they wait 2 hours or an hour before they answer that question. So I'm just going to answer it for you right now. The reason I think that ministry feels so hard right now is because of the secular. So that's it. We're done. Thank you. That was well worth 32-hour flight to be here. Thank you very much. All right, so here's the issue is, I don't know how to take the applause that I'm done right there. Should I feel good that you liked my joke or just like, get this guy out of here? All right, so here's the problem. When you answer the secular to any question, it only takes just a little bit of thought till you realize the secular is a really complicated word. And I don't know if you've had this experience where you'll say things like, oh, well, one of the big challenges with the church in New Zealand is that this is such a secular society, or it's so much more secular in the last 30 years than it was before. And then you start to talk to someone else about this, and what they say the secular is and what you say the secular is, you don't really feel like it's the same. It's a very confusing word. It's a very kind of multivalent word. And if I was to give you a note card right now and have you write your definition of the secular on it, and we were to collect these, we're not going to do this. So, introverts, it's okay. But you were to, hand them all in, and we were to put up on the big piece of paper or a whiteboard everyone's definition of the secular, there would be a lot of overlap, but there would also be some differences. So what I want to do with these 2 hours, in a kind of story form, is unfold this word for us and see if we can get clear on what we mean when we say the secular. And I think there's a lot at stake here in this, because I think if we get the definition of the secular wrong, at least in my society, what's happening with a lot of pastors and a lot of ministry organizations and things like that is they're getting the definition of the secular wrong, and then out of their best intentions, I think they're actually making matters worse. They don't mean to make matters worse. Out of their best intentions, however, they are doing that. So to try to tell you this story and try to explain what the secular is, we do have to go back in time a bit. And so I asked Abby to have the time machine here. And unfortunately, it was checked out or something. So we can't use the time machine. We couldn't go 88 miles an hour right out front of this road. So that's my Back to the Future reference. So no DeLoreans racing down the street. So we're going to have to do this in our minds. But I want to take you back in time. Let's go back in time. Let's leave New Zealand. Let's go. We have to stay in the West, and I'll explain that as we go. But let's go somewhere exotic. Let's go somewhere kind of nice and fancy. Let's go to Paris. So let's go 14th century, let's go to Paris, let's walk the Latin Quarter of Paris in the 14th century. If we were able to do that, we would enter a society where there was no such thing as the secular. There was no such thing as the secular. If a dial existed of the secular, 14th century Europe, 14th century in Paris, the dial would be set at 0. There was no secular. Now, that's not to say people were ignorant or stupid. They knew when they went to the cathedral and they took the Eucharist, when the priest held up the chalice, they knew that that was a sacred thing. And when they went onto their farms to harvest, they knew the shovel or the hoe was a profane thing. And by profane, I don't mean gross or bad. I simply mean not used in holy activity. They knew what was used in holy activity and what was not. But all those things, for the most part, just fit together. They all just click together like a puzzle. That there really was no such thing in this kind of society as an atheist. It was nearly impossible to find an atheist. As a matter of fact, we didn't really even have a word for it across the West of an atheist. It was nearly impossible. Now, this is a statue of I don't know if anyone, does anyone know who this is a statue of? I always say that. No one ever does. Some of you are really looking intently. I'm always very worried about the person who knows who this statue is, because that means you're really into statues and you just are on Google Images all the time looking at statues. And if that's you, you are a weird human being, and I really look forward to meeting you, but let's not talk about your hobbies. Let's keep those to themselves. But this is a statue that's in Venice, Italy. You can go and visit it now. It's off the Grand Canal. And this is a statue of a man that is not quite known, but it's a fairly famous Italian man, a man by the name of Paolo Sarpi. Now, I don't know if you know who Paolo Sarpi is. He's really infamous for two things. One, you probably don't care about much, but he was the dissenting voice at the Council of Trent. All right, you have to be a history nerd to really care about that. More relevantly, or where it will connect with you, is Paolo Sarpi was Galileo's good friend. So Paolo Sarpi is the person who encouraged Galileo to write his book that argued that the earth moved around the sun, not the sun around the earth. And with Paolo Sarpi's prodding, Galileo publishes it. It gets in big trouble with the Catholic Church, particularly gets in big trouble with the Jesuits. And so Paolo Sarpi, that's what he's known for. Now, like I said, you can find this statue. He was from Venice. You can go to Venice. You can find it today. If you find the statue, you will notice very quickly that it sits on a pedestal, and on the pedestal is a plaque. And it will say, Paolo Sarpi, date of birth, date of death, and then there will be a quote in Italian. Now, what you'll need to do is find a hunky Italian man to have him translate that for you, which is the perfect pickup line if you need it. You're welcome. And this is what it will say. It will say, Paolo Sarpi, this is the quote, Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. That's really marvelous. And we're not even talking 14th century. I took you back to the 14th century. We're talking early 16th century. If you die in the early 16th century and you don't believe, you get a statue. I mean, that's amazing. Now, the traffic getting here last night was awful, but I would imagine if there had to be a statue for every non-believer in all of Christchurch, you'd have to line them up on the motorway and the traffic would be worse. But even in the early 16th century, to not believe would mean dying in infamy. And yet, now this has changed quite a bit. So like I said, it wasn't even really possible not to believe. It was hard to make even a statement of not believing at all. Now, I don't know what it would be like. I have no idea what it would be like to be late modern like we are and go all the way back to something like secular zero. I'm not sure it's even possible, and I only know one thought experiment that's tried to imagine what it would be like to be modern, late modern like us, and go all the way back to a society that is secular zero. And it's a dystopian novel turned into a TV show called The Handmaid's Tale. Has anyone seen The Handmaid's Tale? Yeah, so they're now on season 6 of The Handmaid's Tale. And if you want not to sleep for a week, watch The Handmaid's Tale, because both it's very bingeable, so you'll just be up all night watching episode after episode, but it's also really quite frightening. And if you know anything about this TV series, it's based off a novel written by a Canadian author named Margaret Atwood. She wrote it in the mid-1980s, and she really is playing a thought experiment. In what she's imagining, she's kind of watched the Iranian crisis happen in a very kind of liberal society turn back to a more kind of religious, secular zero society. So she plays out in this novel imagining what would happen if a far-right religious group took over America. And America falls, and America no longer exists, and a new country has come about where America was, called Gilead. And Gilead takes the society back to secular zero. The way you dress, the way you talk, every function of life has to reverberate this deep sense of belief. There is no way to escape it. As a matter of fact, that is the kind of plot of the book and of season 1. People are trying to get out of Gilead, and they cannot get out of Gilead. But one of the frightening things, and if you watch season 1, is that these women, particularly that they're following around, like I said, have to dress in their station before God as handmaids, and then they go to the supermarket, and they have to enact the liturgy. If they don't, they get punished. So they go to the supermarket, and they see someone, and they have to enact the liturgy. Under his eye, may the Lord open. So even the way you talk publicly reverberates belief and reverberates the sense of the liturgy. You cannot escape it. And Margaret Atwood thinks it's an absolute nightmare that you could be modern and you could go back to this. She's frightened of it. Now, like I said, Canadian author, and I actually said that in her plot, America no longer exists. And that is true, except not quite true. If you know the book enough, you know America does still exist, but as a small enclave in Toronto. So there's just like the Americans in diaspora in Toronto. And the literature really is dystopian literature. She thinks it's a dystopia. But if you ask me, and if you know Canadians, any Canadians in the room, you know that's really actually fantasy. That's fantasy literature. Canadians are so nice and so welcoming and love to apologize as a national art. But what they deeply long for, more than the Stanley Cup, is for America to exist in Toronto. That is the most luscious thing they could ever imagine. And I've said that to Canadians, to Canadian groups of people, and they're like, yeah, that would be luscious if that happened. But I talked to a lot of bishops and executive presbyters and seminary professors and people who are very worried about the future of the church, worried about young people and where are all the young people, and not one of them has ever said to me, you know what we're going for in our presbytery? You know what we're going for in our synod? We're going for Handmaid's Tale. No one has ever said that because it feels like an absolute nightmare. But if part of the point, which I often hear in conversations with those folks, is rhetoric of fear that people are leaving, that we need more people. Well, I mean, like I said, the plot of The Handmaid's Tale, season 1, you can't leave it. And you want to leave it, but you can't leave it. It's got its tentacles in you. But no one wants that. No one wants to go back to something like this. And Margaret Atwood, like I said, thinks it's an absolute nightmare that you could be a modern society and you could go back to secular zero. And I think she thinks it's a nightmare, and I think it's a nearly impossible thing because you need to have 3 things to live in a secular zero society that I just don't think, I mean, we can have this conversation, but I don't think we have. And the 3 things you need to have is, first of all, a deep sense that you are living in an enchanted world. In other words, that there are demons and devils everywhere. To live in a secular zero world, you have to have a deep sense that there are demons and devils, that there are angels and spirits, and they are everywhere doing everything. And not only do you have to have a sense of belief in that personally in some way, but your whole society has to be structured around it. So your whole society has to be organized around the sense that there are demons and devils everywhere. And one of the way a larger society organizes themselves is they take on this conception that things themselves, that you can touch and that you can feel, some of those things are imbued with the divine force, and some of those things are imbued with an evil force. And if you get near those things, yourself, your very being, is porous enough that if you get close to those things, its evil or its good could radiate into your own being. That this could happen. You have to have this kind of imagination. So to illustrate these 3 points in action, there's a great book by a Oxford historian named Keith Thomas who's written this book called Religion and the Decline of Magic. And he's writing about the European medieval period, and particularly about the high medieval period. And he's saying during the high medieval period in England, there was a great controversy. And the great ministerial controversy that all the priests were having to deal with is that they had gotten intel that people were coming to the cathedral to take the Eucharist, that the host was being put on their tongue, and they were holding it in their mouth and not swallowing it. They were leaving the cathedral with it still in their mouth. They were going home, and they were feeding it to their sick pig. They were taking it and putting it on their field, not because they were denigrating it, but because they thought it had the most power. They were respecting it. They thought it was magical, that it hosted it had become the real flesh of Jesus Christ. And if you needed that pig to survive so your kids could be fed, why not give it a little of Jesus' body? You needed a crop yield this year because last year's was a terrible crop yield and almost half the village starved. Why not put a little of Jesus' flesh into the soil and get a better crop yield? Well, you can imagine cardinals, bishops, priests, very, very uncomfortable with this. So they call a meeting and they have everyone come, all the clergy come. They walk days to come to this. I don't know what the email blast that went out that said, why don't you come to our annual presbytery conversation? But they're like, this year the topic will be how to get people to swallow the host. And we were like, oh my gosh, I'm going to walk a week to go to that. There's nothing more relevant in all of our ministry issues than getting people to swallow the host. So people walked for days. They showed up. Thomas reports that at some point, some genius in the room raised his hand. They called on him, and he said, well, I have an idea what we could do. Why don't we make people stick out their tongues and show us that they've swallowed it? Now, if you've watched an Irish or an Italian gangster movie, particularly shot in a Scorsese-esque way. You know there's always a scene of a first communion for mob boss that is going to take out enemies. And the first communion is the alibi that I couldn't kill all my enemies because I was at my daughter's first communion. And then you get the Scorsese scene of spilled blood as it becomes a montage of murders as the mob boss is going to have communion. And you see the mob boss go forward to the railing. Hands go behind back because only the priest can touch the host. Tongue goes out. Priest puts host on tongue. And then mob boss swallows it and then has to show the priest, like a 4-year-old with a sore throat at the doctor's office, that they have swallowed the host. That practice, at least in some Catholic communities, goes all the way back to the 13th century, that you actually show the priest that you have swallowed it. Now, the other thing that they did was ramp up the rhetoric. And they said, all right, well, let's have people stick out their tongues, show us they've swallowed the host, but let's also remind them that there is no holy object more sacred to us than the very body of Jesus Christ. If you misuse this, even on your best intention, if you misuse it, well, you will burn in hell forever. So they ramped up the rhetoric, and historians told us it became church law for the next 100 years that you had to take communion twice a year. And most people took it twice a year. They were absolutely frightened of what would happen when this very holy thing would touch their sinful tongues. Would they survive it? But it was better than the alternative, which is if you didn't take communion twice a year, then you would burn in hell forever. So you risked it. This would happen. Now, I have a son. I think we mentioned this last night. My son is 20, second year, almost done with his second year at university. And I think this is being recorded. So I want this on the record that I love this boy. He's a great kid. I would die for this kid. But I have to tell you, until he was like 20, like 11 to 18, excuse me, biggest pain in the ass that ever existed. I mean, this kid was so difficult to deal with. He was major contrarian. He had convinced me I was the dumbest person who ever existed. You could say anything like, man, what a beautiful blue sky. And he would argue against the sky being blue. Great kid, really smart, but really difficult, kind of 6-7 years. So this particular Sunday in our church, in the church that Carr is the pastor of, when we take communion, we have this beautiful moment where we take it in a circle. It's this beautiful moment where words of institution go over the elements, and usually kind of counterclockwise, basket of bread goes around, and then the cup comes behind it. You have this beautiful moment where you can turn to the person next to you, look them in the eyes, say their name, and give them the elements. It's a kind of beautiful moment. Well, this particular Sunday, my son is, probably 14. He's at his height of his pain in the buttness. And he's standing next to me for this, and the bread starts being passed around. And he turns to me, and he says in a kind of stage whisper, he leans over and he says, "Hey, is that bread gluten-free? Is that gluten-free bread?" Now, this boy hates everything gluten-free. He's completely opposed to things gluten-free. He doesn't like the texture. He doesn't like anything about gluten-free. He actually thinks maybe gluten-free, he's argued before that gluten-free is nothing but a scam. I don't know by who, Big Bread, I guess. I don't know who has done this. But he hates everything gluten-free. And part of it was Cara was gluten-free for a while and was watching her gluten intake. So it became all the more reason to hate gluten-free, was a way to, really annoy his mother. So the bread's being passed, and he leans over to me and he says, "Hey, is that bread gluten-free?" And I know this is going to be a problem, so I don't even look at him. And I just nod my head and I say, yeah, it's gluten-free. This is what this kid does. He then leans over to me, and in a louder stage whisper, he goes, "Well, then I'm out." And he turns around and walks out of church. Now, this is being recorded, so I don't want, don't at me, as the kids say. This is a confession. But I have to confess, it took everything in me to not tackle the boy and beat him in front of the church that day. But just think about that incredibly different cultural imagination of a medieval person in the 13th or 14th century going before the altar, shaking of what would happen when this holy thing would touch their tongue, to my 14-year-old boy who being like, "You know what? don't like the texture of gluten-free, and this will really annoy my mom, so I'm out. Like no fear, no burden of heaven weighing on him at all. Can easily kind of turn from that. So you have to have these three things of this sense of enchantment, things being imbued with the divine force, and the self being porous. Now this is not to say that people across our societies don't hold to this in one way or another, or personally hold to it. But it surely doesn't seem like, at least across the West, that our institutions function this way, that airports work on this. Or I would imagine, maybe you'll surprise me, but I can't imagine at lunch that a bunch of you gather and say, hey, let's talk about faith formation in young people. I mean, Matt's here, and why don't we talk, because I have an idea. I have been on Relics eBay. I don't know if that exists, but I'm sure in the dark web you could find it, and said, I have heard that Peter's ankle bone is up for sale. Why doesn't this presbytery, Alpine's presbytery, gather some funds? We just had the financial report. Why don't you just, use some of those funds, buy Peter's ankle bone, have someone make a nice case for it, then have somebody else write some prayers for it, then just get your adolescents to walk past Peter's ankle bone and say these prayers. You can pass it all around the presbytery. There you go. You're done. You've done youth ministry. Faith formation has happened. Many of us would find that not quite adequate. But our ancestors in the faith would think that's a very logical thing. I mean, we forget that all of these majorly beautiful cathedrals across Europe were originally built as reliquaries. I mean, Notre Dame in Paris, Louis builds it. Why? I mean, not just function. It's not built for function. It's built because he has Jesus' crown of thorns. That building is supposed to house Jesus' crown of thorns. Function is only the second purpose. I tell my American students all the time, try that in your congregation. Try with a session to say, we want a whole new building because we have Mary Magdalene's toenails. So we want a whole new wing here, and that's what we're going to do. They'd be like, no, but if you want a gym to attract more young people, we're okay with that. Very kind of different imagination at play. Now, what happens in secular zero when we think of the quote-unquote, we need to keep this in quotes, but the best ministry or the best pastor, usually that becomes about giving people access. So the best ministry, the best pastor is about giving people access. Access out of the demonic into the holy, access to the holy sacrament, that it becomes really ultimately about access. Now, I tell you all of this because we haven't even said what the secular is. But this is really important that we look at the backdrop that whatever the secular is, however it comes about, it comes out of this kind of society. It comes out of society where there was just no sense of a division in any way within belief and action. That this, whatever the secular is, it comes out of a society where belief was everywhere and you couldn't escape it. So the secular then arrives, out of secular zero, you're going to be shocked by this, but from secular zero, we'll have something arrive called secular one. And secular one arrives, or the secular arrives when something incredibly profound happens that we all live with, and it's so deep within our consciousness that we barely see it. But what occurs is there becomes this divide in our imaginations between what is public and what is private. Now, the way to think about this is I'm sure this isn't true in New Zealand as it is in North America, there was someone in your life who taught you that when you go to a dinner party, there are 4 topics you should never talk about at a dinner party. Somebody taught you this, your grandmother or your auntie or your grandfather or something. So when you go to a dinner party, you should never talk about these 4 things. The first thing you should never talk about is you should just never talk about money. Don't go up to someone that you're meeting and say, hey, nice to meet you. Hey, how much money do you make? I mean, that would be an incredibly rude thing to do. The second thing you were not supposed to talk about, at least we were taught this in North America, is you don't talk about politics. Don't come up to someone and ask them about their political affiliation. Really hard for American now because politics has become entertainment. So it's almost like, what else would I talk about but politics? But you weren't supposed to do that. It was a rude thing to ask someone about their political affiliation. Third thing, I think this is hung on. The third thing you're not supposed to talk about when you met someone at a dinner party, do not ask them about their sex life. It'd be incredibly rude to say, hey, good to meet you. Just tell me a little bit about your sex life. I'd be really interested in that. I mean, that would be an incredibly rude thing to meet someone at the presbytery meeting and talk to them about that over lunch. But then the fourth thing, what was the fourth thing we weren't supposed to talk about? Was religion. So there it is, the four things you're not supposed to talk about. Money, politics, sex, and religion. Why are those the four topics you're not supposed to talk about? Well, it's really clear. Those four topics you are not supposed to talk about because the presumption is those four things are private. And polite people do not talk about private things in public. Now, this is a quite amazing change. I mean, it's so deeply endemic within us, we almost don't even see how profound it is. But when the secular arrives, when there becomes a divide between the public and the private, and belief itself becomes a private thing. When that happens, then the dawn of the secular occurs. Because what's public is not necessarily formed by belief, or the assumption is it's not formed by belief, and belief becomes mainly and mostly a private reality. So instead of enchantment, things, the self being porous, they're replaced with things like the will. This becomes, now the will becomes very important. So it's not things per se that matter, and being close to those things or near those things, walking in a pilgrimage to a relic, that is not the point anymore. Now what's important is what happens to your own private constitution of what you hold to, what you believe, what you'll enact. All right, let me try to illustrate this for you by showing you a video clip, and we are going to really hope that the audio works here. But this is a video clip that comes from our public news, our PBS station. And this was, some of you will remember this. You should remember this. It's hard to remember this because it happened before the pandemic. And it's hard to remember anything that happened before the pandemic. But do you remember the day before the pandemic when we got word? I'm not sure what time it would have happened in New Zealand, but in North America, we got word pretty kind of early afternoon that Notre Dame in Paris was on fire. Remember this? And then it became one of the most annoying days in social media history, which is to say a lot because there's been a lot of annoying days in the history of social media. But everyone needed to post their picture of them at Notre Dame from like 20 or 30 years ago. And it was a major, as the kids say, flex. You know, like everyone was saying, like, look at, I was in Paris once. We're like, yeah, we get it. All right, yeah, settle down. But I want to show you the news story that night on this, our public news. You're going to see the woman they're interviewing. She's the dean of the Episcopal Chapel in Paris. And I just want you to listen to how she talks about this, because it shows, I think, a big transformation in imagination. Yep, do we have volume? Oh, it was coming. Here, I'll try it again. Yeah, here we go.
Little Ed is Dean of the American Cathedral in Paris.
It's brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The Dean is grateful that so many relics survive.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus' crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
At present, the precise...
All right, so you hear it. It's almost as if I paid her to say that. It illustrates this point very well. But what she says, I mean, it's fascinating, and showing you that isn't to say, look at how stupid she is, what a dumb thing to say. That's exactly how I would answer if a camera was in my face. She might actually be quite right about how she answers. But against the backdrop of an earlier imagination that I just shared with you, it's a very different kind of conception of reality. Where her first question is, you know, or the first statement she makes is it really? I mean, is the crown of thorns, is it really Jesus' crown of thorns? I mean, is it really, really Jesus' crown of thorns? I mean, first of all, that's a very modern question to ask. No pre-modern person, it's a very modern Western question to ask. No pre-modern person for sure would have ever asked that question. I mean, really, was it really, really? I mean, what does she mean? Like, can we do a DNA test and Jesus was on there? I mean, was it really, really, truly Jesus' crown of thorns? But then the interesting thing is she says, doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter if it really was Jesus' crown of thorns or not, because, and this is where I want you to see, the impetus goes internal instead of external. It doesn't matter if that crown of thorns really is Jesus' crown of thorns. What matters is, and she holds this as having significance, what matters is it became something that impacted people. It led people to pray. It moved people's hearts towards God. So the weight, the gravity goes internal instead of external. At a certain level, it doesn't matter if it's really Jesus' crown of thorns or not. What matters is what it did to people internally. So when I say wills, I don't mean like people become rational calculators, but I do mean that we start to think what belief itself is what I hold to, what I'll contend with, what I'll enact and believe. So you can hear echoes of the Protestant Reformation here. I mean, this is Martin Luther saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other. My consciousness will not allow me not to make this claim." And Luther still remains the hero of the West, at least at that level, that he's the one who bursts in us what matters and even what belief is what I hold to internally, what I can consent to, not just in my brain, but what leads me to choose to enact this. Now, like I said, Protestantism plays a big part in this, that Protestantism really does turn the will to being very significant. But this, as it kind of bursts the secular, this is not lowering the bar of belief. At the beginning within Protestantism, and we're all inheritors of this tradition here, it is heightening the bar. My students, I teach at a Lutheran seminary, my students' favorite doctrine is the priesthood of all believers, which across Lutheran and Reformed communities we hold to. They love it in their ordination process. They have to write a little essay, and they always will say their favorite doctrine is the priesthood of all believers. And they almost always get the priesthood of all believers completely wrong. Because the way they think of the priesthood of all believers is they think of it as democracy, or they think it as anti-hierarchy. So they think the priesthood of believers means that the clerics can't tell us what to do, that we get to decide for ourselves. And there is something about that that's true within the Protestant Reformation, but particularly within the Formed expression of this, that's really not what it means. What it really means is all of us now have to live like priests. That there are not a bunch of people on a hill in a monastery who pray for us and read the scriptures for us. We all have to do it. We all have to turn our hearts towards God every day, and we have to read our scriptures, and we have to pray like a priest. And as Luther even said, doesn't matter if you're milking cows, changing a baby's diaper, cleaning rooms at an inn, you do it now as a priest with your heart turned towards God. So at the beginning of this really raises the bar, that we all have to live this way. So I grew up in a conservative Lutheran denomination, and I remember one sermon from all my growing up. And that's a terrible, terrible thing, because I was a nerdy church kid who was at just about every Sunday, and I can only remember one sermon. It just shows you my brain was completely corrupted by reruns of Gilligan's Island that I watched over and over and over again. But I seriously remember one sermon, and it was a one time my Lutheran pastor. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I shouldn't say this, I know this is being recorded too, but wasn't the greatest preacher who ever existed. And pretty much in a kind of classic Lutheran way, only really preached Paul's epistles, because Lutherans, if you don't know, just love Paul's epistles. And that's all he preached. But the one sermon I remember was when he went off script, and he preached his Jonathan Edwards-like sermon. Now, I don't know if you know Jonathan Edwards, this kind of American Reformed theologian. Edwards would preach 2-3 hour long sermons, and it was like the learned man of the kind of colonial era America, great American theologian. But he was in your business. You know, he was just always prodding his congregation to live at this high level of being a priest. Well, I remember my pastor's one Jonathan Edwards-esque sermon, because the refrain of the sermon was this. He said, from the pulpit, he said, if you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. Very Jonathan Edwards. Very much every second of every day, you have to turn your heart towards God. And we know this in the States. We actually have documentation of this, of Puritan women who came over in the 1700s and would keep time journals of every second of every day. Did they have their hearts turned towards God? You can see how high that bar is. But my pastor, this refrain, if you waste time, you steal from God. And I remember sitting in the sanctuary. I can still remember where I was seated. And I kept running that refrain over and over in my head. If you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. I couldn't believe it. And then I remember thinking to myself, my gosh, I'm in 5th grade. That's what I thought. I am 11 years old. And I thought, I've been going to school for 6 years. I go to school from 8 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. And then I thought, I hate school. I hate everything about school. What I have done over these 6 years is hone my time-wasting skills. All I do is waste time. I sneak magazines into class. I have a whole daydreaming strategy I go through. Like, I have become a time-wasting savant. I couldn't believe it. If you waste time, you steal from God. That was his one Jonathan Edwards sermon. He never preached another. He just went back to Paul's epistles. But you see this very different sense that the will, you have to turn it towards God at every second of every day. The bar is very high. Now, of course, into the 19th century, into the 20th century, people start to wonder, what if I don't? What if I don't? What if I don't live like a priest? What happens to me? Does lightning strike me from heaven? What occurs? And people can start kind of letting go of that demand. And they can even start to say, in a kind of reverse image of Luther, here I stand, I can do no other in not believing. But it starts in this passion that we have to willfully enact this. We have to live this out. Now, with this will, the other thing that happens that I think we're all living in the legacy of, and maybe in the last days of, I don't know, maybe not, is that this really becomes the time where the modern denomination comes around, which we are all living in now, this kind of sense of the modern denomination. And here's the one thing I think across every modern denomination, that's the little hidden inner reality that frightens everybody who has some skin in the game for a modern denomination, is we know this either explicitly or implicitly, that every modern denomination can only exist for one more generation. Now let me be clear what I mean by that. I don't mean every modern denomination, like the Methodists, like the Presbyterians, like the Lutherans, like the Anglicans, that they will only exist for one more generation. I don't mean that. But what I mean is that every modern denomination knows that unless the next generation decides to enact their lives inside that denomination will not exist if the next generation doesn't do that. That the only mechanism to make sure that the Methodists continue is the next generation has to have enough young people who decide they will enact their lives as Methodists for the Methodist Church to continue, and so on with each one. Now, I don't know if this is true in New Zealand. Maybe, Matt, you can tell me. But in the States, every mainline denomination particularly has some kind of every 3-year youth gathering where all the young people of the denomination come together. And the denomination that I teach in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, it is very creatively called the Youth Gathering. Yeah, the PCUSA, it's called the Triennium, but in the ELCA, it's called the Youth Gathering. And every 3 years, they come together. And it's quite an amazing thing, and I think this is true with the PCUSA as well as with the ELCA. When you look at the kind of church-wide office, like the central church-wide, every budget line has what we would call reverse hockey stick down. Like, it is just, every budget line has just gone down incredibly over the last decade and a half. At least within the ELCA, the only one that has not reverse hockey sticked has been this every 3-year youth gathering. It has gone down, but kind of slowly. And at one level, you think, wow, that's really great. They still care about the kids. They just really care about the next generation. But I think actually the reason they have not allowed all that money to disappear is partly because they do care about the kids, but the other part is they know as a kind of existential terror that if the next generation does not decide to enact their lives as ELCA Lutherans, there will be no ELCA Lutheran denomination. And it really does become every 3 years a kind of pep fest for the denomination. They come from all over, and this is America, so you can still gather a bunch of people. So they go to some kind of sports arena, and they can get 10, 15,000 Lutherans in a room, and all these young people are there, and it becomes a pep fest for being Lutheran. I was at one a few years ago, and I happened to become creepy guy listening to high school girls talk. I didn't mean to be, but I was walking down this convention center, and I was trying to get past these two girls who looked like they were maybe 16, 17, and they were walking really slow, and it was day 3 of 4, and they were just glowing. They loved this event. It was so great. And I was annoyingly trying to get past them as they were kind of teasing each other, and I just had to wait for the hallway to open, so I was just stuck behind them. And this is when I became an annoying guy listening to high school girls talk, because I was actually annoyed with them, trying to get past them. But one of the girls ended up kicking her friend, like they were side by side, and she did this thing where you do that, and you kind of supposed to be like a trick, like where did this come from? But of course the girl who got kicked knew immediately that was her friend who kicked her. But it was all done in kind of fun and teasing, and the girl who got kicked kind of played it up. And so she looked at her friend, and in my memory they were from California. I'm not sure that's true, but it's more fun to tell the story if they're from California. So the girl got kicked, and she looked at her friend, and she's like, oh my gosh, like, I can't, like, believe, like, you just kicked me. And she really kind of played it up. And I was really annoyed at this point, like, please, hallway, open up so I can get away from these girls. She's like, I can't believe you just kicked me. And then she said this, she says, I can't believe, like, you just kicked me. That is such an un-Lutheran thing to do. And it stopped me in my tracks. I stopped and I went, un-Lutheran? An un-Lutheran thing to do. Like, she didn't say, that's a very unethical thing to do, or that's an unbiblical thing to do. She said, that's an un-Lutheran thing to do. And I thought, un-Lutheran? And I thought, well, if she would have turned to her friend, put her arm around her and said, hey, we're hearing all this stuff about justification by faith alone, but I want you to know your works really matter. That, folks, would have been very un-Lutheran. That would have been a very un-Lutheran thing to do. But kicking your friend wasn't un-Lutheran, but she got exactly why the denomination was pouring millions of dollars into this event. Because for at least these 4 days, she was trying on what it would be to imagine herself as a Lutheran. Now, would it last 4 more weeks, or 4 years, or till she's 44? Probably not. But it was worth a try, because if the next generation does not decide to enact themselves inside this denomination, what else keeps it going? Now, that's a really powerful reality. No medieval priest would have ever thought, if people in this village just decide not to come, then the whole church will just disappear. They couldn't imagine that that was a possibility. But we all live with this sense. Like, if people just willfully decide, maybe even not explicitly, they just get distracted by other things and decide not to enact their lives inside this denominational affiliation, inside any kind of religious conception, it could all just disappear. That's a very different kind of reality that we live in. But it's this deep sense that we think that there's a kind of public-private divide, and belief is an internal thing of enacted will. The second piece here is not only are there wills, but we make a shift from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. To illustrate this, let me tell you my favorite prank I like to play on American pastors. And it surrounds this. I put up this slide here of January 31st, 2018, and I say to a room of American pastors, I say, you remember this, right? You remember when this happened? And this is we had, at least in the northern hemisphere, we had a super red blood moon. And I said, remember this date, because you all have this date just seared in your head, because 10 days before this and 10 days after this, you had never done more pastoral care calls than during this time. You guys remember that? And they all started to get really nervous because no one remembers that, and no one was busy, so they started looking at each other like, what was wrong with me? I wasn't. But I'm like, I play it up like, you remember how exhausted you were. It was just pastoral care call after pastoral care call. You were getting texts and phone calls and emails saying, Pastor, can we meet? And they all start to get panicked, thinking something's wrong with their ministry. And of course, the fact is no one was busy during this time. And like I said, this is a super red blood moon. But you could imagine, in another imagination, in another imaginary, you could have had a ton of pastoral care calls. People could have said, Pastor, I need to talk. I hear there's going to be a super red blood moon, but I just interviewed for a new job, and I'm going to take my family to Auckland in this new job. But now I hear there's a super red blood moon. Does God want me to do it or not? Or, Pastor, we're trying to have a baby, but now there's a super red blood moon. Is it safe to have a baby, or is it not safe to have a baby? What does this mean? Pastor, I need to talk to you because there's going to be this super red blood moon. What does this mean? When you live in a cosmos, the idea is even the natural phenomenon has a message. It means something. It speaks. But when you live in a universe, there's no message in this anymore. It doesn't mean anything. We actually have a mathematical equation that will tell us when the next one is going to occur. It's just laws and numbers. It doesn't mean anything. Now, wait a minute. Of course, if you lived in the northern hemisphere at this time, you could have gotten yourself up early. You could have got up at 4:30, got outside and seen this, and you could have been bombarded with beauty You could have been moved, and it could have changed you. You could have thought, my gosh, there is a God, because look at how amazing that is. But the person next to you, not moved at all. And that person would have said to you, that's great that works for you. Doesn't mean anything to me. So even in the natural phenomenon, the idea is to have it have meaning, you have to make it make meaning. Again, the gravity goes internal, not external. So even when some kind of cosmological occurrence happens, the idea is there's no meaning in it. There's no message in it, unless you can find meaning and message in it. If that works for you, then that's great. But there's nothing external out there. And you surely don't need your pastor to interpret it for you. You surely don't need your pastor to tell you what this means, because there's no larger story going on here. There's no unfolding story of God moving history. Now, of course, we believe there is, but you see how the whole current of the kind of cultural reality is to say even natural phenomenon, it doesn't mean anything. And this is a very different kind of imagination. For a medieval person, I do not want to go back to the medieval period, but for a medieval person to say there's a God, all they would have to do is look at the trees. Of course, what else happens here? Look at the beauty here. For us, that's no proof at all. For most modern people, that's no proof at all. Now, that's not to say that some people don't go up into a country like this and go on a hike here and are moved by something. But our idea, again, is you have to make that mean something to you. The meaning isn't there in that thing. The meaning is what it does for you. So again, you see the public-private divide, that even the natural phenomenon has no inherent meaning within itself. It is here. You may go on that walk, and that may move you, but that doesn't mean it's objective. That doesn't mean that it proves anything else except the meaning you make internally. So this clicks us forward that in secular one, it moves from access to it moves to demonstrate. So we can think about it like this, that the church becomes a place of demonstration. The pastor becomes the person who helps people demonstrate. Now think about this again within the public-private divide. So the church becomes the public place where people demonstrate what they privately believe. Quote unquote, that is the good church. Again, I want to throw that into quotes. That is what the good church is it's a public place where people can come and demonstrate what they privately believe. And this puts a lot of pressure on the pastor now, because the pastor's job is to be a public person who can preach sermons, can lead Bible studies, that somehow can cross over. They're done. They're heralded from the pulpit as a public act, but then they can transfer into people's private lives and reconstitute the way they believe. And then to complete the circuit, then they come to a congregation, or they enact in the congregation, and they demonstrate that has happened to them by, volunteering with the children's ministry, and being on session, and giving money, and being in other forms of leadership. So that becomes that kind of public act. And it does have vampire logic to it. Remember when vampires were everywhere in pop culture? Like every other show was a vampire show. I don't know how, I wasn't a huge vampire person, but you couldn't avoid vampires 10 years ago. But one of the vampire logic is, I don't know who wrote this vampire logic, but I guess how vampires work is that, I don't think they're real, but I'll leave that for you to determine. But at least in the TV shows and movies, that a vampire could not enter the threshold of your house unless they were invited in. There was some kind of force field that they couldn't cross over your doorway into your house unless you said, welcome on in, vampire. If you welcome that vampire in, then they could suck your blood and eat you. But if you said you're not welcome in this house, they couldn't go. Well, in the same kind of logic inside of secular one, that functions for the pastor. For the most part, the pastor is not welcomed into people's private lives. Not directly. You can't do like Jonathan Edwards and just kick down the door and tell people and say to them from the pulpit or in a pastoral care visit, I notice how you're raising your 12-year-old terrible way. You are leading your children to hell. You are not disciplining them. You are not making them read the scriptures. What you will get from most people will say, thank you, pastor, but this is none of your business. We have not invited you into our private lives. Now, they could be in crisis. That 14-year-old daughter could be in major crisis, and they could come to you and say, Pastor, could you help us we need to find a therapist, or we just are trying to make sense of this, or our anxiety is so high, help us with this. But then, again, vampire logic, they've invited you in. But the idea is you are a public person that somehow has to get internal to their private lives and help constitute their belief, but you cannot kick down that door. You have to be invited in some ways. So now there's all sorts of pressure, like your sermons, they have to be funny. They have to be engaging. They have to move people in a certain way, because it's not enough that this is just, you can't just get up in the pulpit and say to the congregation after you read the scripture, behold, the word of the Lord. I'm about to give you the word of the Lord. And then have them go, oh my gosh. Yeah, no, there's a buffer here that maybe that matters to them, maybe it doesn't. All of a sudden they're just thinking about rugby the whole time that you're preaching to them. And somehow while they're thinking about rugby, you have to preach a sermon that grabs hold of their inner constitution and starts to shift their belief in a way that doesn't violate the boundary between their public and their private. It becomes a much more nimble kind of way that you have to live this out. But we live with this. So secular one arrives, and we all have to live with this public-private reality. Now I want to take us one more step. And what time is lunch? 10 after? Oh, 2 o'clock. Yeah. So some people in this room are like, don't say that to him. He'll just go. But we, yeah, good. I'm going to take us one more step, and then I think we'll be able to have a little bit of time for Q&A. And then we'll be able to pick up after lunch. So from secular one, you're going to be shocked by this, but what comes potentially next? But what I want you to see is whatever comes next, this isn't stage theory. So you're not in secular one and then you grow out of it and you go to secular two. You know, it's not like being in first grade and then going to second grade. It builds on it. So once secular one arrives in a society, it is there. It doesn't depart from there. And so what gets built on top of it is what we might call secular two. Now my guess is if I did pass out those note cards to people and had you write your definition of the secular, that most of you would have written a secular two definition. I think across our societies, when people tend to talk about the secular, particularly when the media talks about the secular, they almost always mean secular two. So how should we define secular two? Secular two is usually defined as something like this. Fewer and fewer people are going to church. Our religious institutions are weaker and weaker. Unlike generations ago, we have to close churches often. Our ministry training centers have fewer and fewer students in it. There are fewer and fewer people coming to church. So this has this kind of sense, it's almost a doubling down in the public and private, where we have a sense where the a-religious space continues to be growing and the religious space is shrinking. At least pastors in my country really feel like this. Like all a-religious space keeps growing. So there's a sense that youth soccer and basketball, those spaces keep growing, getting your kids in piano lessons and all of these other things that they have to get their kids to, those all hold more and more weight for middle class parents, but having any connection to any religious community seems to be dissipating. And maybe is now even in New Zealand generations away. It's been 2-3 generations since it's mattered, and it just feels like the a-religious space just keeps growing in significance and the religious space keeps shrinking. So fewer and fewer people are actually going to our churches. That seems to be what we think the secular is. Now I have a friend who was a former student who is now a pastor of a mid-sized church outside of Minneapolis where I live, and he told me that he did a terrible thing. And I want to share it with you because I don't want you ever to repeat this. And I think I'm safe this far away from home telling you this very terrible thing he did. The terrible thing he did is that he Googled his church. Don't ever Google your church. It's a terrible thing to do. He Googled his church, and I don't know if you've realized this about Google, but you can Google review anything. I think if you wanted to, you could Google review this chair right here. Like you can Google review anything. And he did the worst thing, which is really, don't do this. You hear him being tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't the worst thing he could do. But he Googled his church. He realized his church had a bunch of Google reviews. And he did the worst thing, which you should never do, is never, ever read a Google review about your church. It will eat away your soul and destroy you. Do not read a Google review about your church. But he thought he could get away with it because he had like 4.8 stars out of 5 on his church. He thought, well, I could use some affirmation today, so I'm going to read these. So he starts reading them, and they all were really positive. Like the first one said, we love this church. The carpets are always clean at this church. And then the second one said, we love this church. We feel so safe putting our daughter in the church nursery because they are committed to sanitizing all the nursery toys every quarter, and we are sure our daughter is not going to pick up the flu from this church. We love this church. And the third one said, we love this church. The preaching is above average, worth our 20-minute drive. And he said that each one was written this way, and he started to realize, he got this sinking feeling as he read 3 and 4 of these, because they were written in the exact same format as an Airbnb review. They were all about the amenities. And this becomes, I think, part of the problem, is that we tend to assume what it means to live in a secular age is we are losing market share, and we are losing it quickly. So whatever we do, or how we're going to have to face this, is we're going to have to find ways to win more and more market share back. We are going to have to get more creative. We are going to have to get more entrepreneurial. We have got to find a way to stop the bleeding of relevance, of resources, of members, and we got to stop this somehow. And this is what it means to live in a secular age. We're living in a secular age because fewer and fewer people want to go to church. We are losing ground. So it shifts from this sense of demonstrate to participate. That the best church wins more participation. And that's what you have to do. If you want to be a good pastor, if you want to be a good church, if you really want to confront this kind of secular age, you need to somehow win more participation. I'm sure this is not true in New Zealand, but it is definitely true in America that the first question pastors ask each other after what's your name is, how big's your church? And it's a bit of an icebreaker, but it's also a lot of a sizing up. And a certain sense that you have the most significance in the presbytery if your church is the biggest. And that there's this sense that the good pastor, the good church, is winning more and more participation. Now, I want to be really clear about this and not seem too kind of Pollyanna-ish, but at least in my country, I would imagine it's true here in New Zealand, this is an issue. This is an absolute issue. If you have to oversee the church budget, I mean, we just heard the finance report. These things are very, very important. It would be incredibly naive to say it doesn't matter. In my country, most churches, like 70% of the churches, if not more, are one roof leak away from being done. They will never recover with one roof leak they were not expecting, and a bill for $500,000 to $1 million comes in because of that slate roof, and they will never recover from it. So this is a big issue. And if you have a 10-hour-a-week children's minister who you'd like to keep employed, and fewer people start coming to your church, therefore there's not enough giving to keep the budget going, this is an issue. So I don't want us to be naive, and anyone who has to oversee any budget, this is an issue. Fewer people means less resources, less money. However, I'm not sure what it actually means to live in a secular age, is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. I think this is actually our red herring. Our red herring that this is the big issue, that the best pastor will have to win more market share. I actually think not only will that burn you out, but it may not be what it actually means to live in a secular age. Now, we are in New Zealand, the place where you are famous for, of course, your rugby team, but also for Lord of the Rings. And you remember the first time you watched the first Lord of the Rings movie? Some of you, I think, you remember this. I remember watching the first Lord of the Rings. It was around Christmas time, and I sat in the movie theater for 3.5 hours. And then at the very end of the 3.5 hours, Frodo turns to his buddy and says, "We're going to take this ring up the mountain," and the credits roll. And I remember turning to my friend and going, "Wait, what? We sat here for 3.5 hours for the movies to begin? Like the movie's just supposed to begin now, and I got to wait 3 years for the next thing to start?" Well, that feeling that you had watching Lord of the Rings is exactly how you should feel about this presentation. Because now we need to break. and I have left you hanging on secular 2 is not the problem, but where we are and what it really means to live in a secular age, you're going to have to come back. So if you had plans this afternoon after lunch, like I'm leaving after lunch, well, you're never going to find out what happened. So we'll pick it up after this. We'll go to lunch now, and I'm going to leave you on this cliffhanger. Yeah. That this is, I mean, we feel this. We feel this deeply. But it may be that this is not what it means to live in a secular age. And I'll just end with this. Remember I said that sometimes, even out of our best intentions, if we're not clear on what it really means to live in a secular age, we may make matters worse. And I think this is part of it. If we think it is, we're losing market share, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough relevance, we don't have enough resources, that it actually may make matters worse. And I'll explain that after lunch.